A shocking crime.
Murders don't happen in Telluride. It was just so bizarre.
A billion-dollar fortune.
There isn't anyone in America that doesn't know the name U-Haul.
And accusations that would tear a family apart.
They were my brothers, but they certainly are capable of evil things.
Was it a random crime or the final straw in a vicious family feud? The American dream destroyed by greed. Tonight on Power, Privilege, and Justice.
The quiet resort town of Telluride lies nestled against Colorado's majestic San Juan mountain range.
Telluride sits at 8,700 feet in the Rocky Mountains, mostly rural area, and very wealthy people now have moved to Telluride and bought up a lot of the homes.
The town's quaint Victorian architecture and world-class ski runs make it known among the rich and famous as Colorado's best-kept secret.
Telluride's very exclusive. It's a lovely little town.
It's very quiet, not a lot of crime there. People leave their keys in their vehicles. People will leave their houses unlocked all night.
But on the morning of August 6th, 1990, the town's solitude would be shattered by a child's 911 call.
My mom, I woke up, she's terrible, shaking. What is your name? Eva Shoen. I live in mysterious. I'm a big, large house. There was blood on the bed. Please send somebody.
The girl, 10-year-old Eva Shoen, heads to a neighbor's for help.
Benta came running down the road, and she just said, I need you to come to my house. Something's happened to my mom. She led me to Eva. I felt for a pulse and was going to try and perform CPR, but then as soon as I touched her, I knew she had been dead for a while.
Bill Masters, the sheriff of San Miguel County, races to the scene.
I went in and walked up the stairs. She was lying on the stairway, obvious gunshot wound to the chest. It was pretty obvious there had been a homicide.
According to the children, nothing unusual had happened the night before. Their father, Sam, was away on business. Their mother, Eva, had shut all 6 of the family's dogs in the laundry room before she went to sleep. And neither Benta nor her brother Espen heard the dogs barking or any other strange noises. Investigators begin searching the home for clues.
It wasn't like any 4th century, nothing really disturbed.
Although the home is filled with valuables, nothing appears to be missing.
One of the things that I noted was that it was a very expensive piece of jewelry that was hanging on a nail above the bed that Eva had been sleeping on, and that wasn't taken.
The first thing that struck me when I walked into the bedroom was that the foot of the bed was a .25 auto shell casing from a semi-automatic handgun.
And among the victim's bed sheets, a puzzling clue.
There was a spot of blood on the bed sheets, and within that spot of blood, there was a chunk of bed sheet that had been torn and cut and removed.
Investigators scour the home, but the missing piece of sheet is nowhere to be found.
The Colorado Bureau of Investigation came in and fingerprinted everything, did hair and fiber analysis, did all the crime scene photos. And no fingerprints of any suspect were located.
There was no latent prints. There wasn't any physical evidence there at all. Most of the crimes that I investigate, people make mistakes and leave physical evidence behind. And this one, we didn't have a lot to work with. The first thing the crime scene tech said to me was that it looks like the people who broke into the home and perpetrated the crime planned it out.
A murder in Telluride? The picture-perfect village rarely saw a crime more serious than window peeping at Oprah's chalet. News of the killing roared through town like an avalanche.
Murders don't happen in Telluride. It was just so bizarre for something like that to happen in our little Shangri-La.
Initially, we talked to neighbors. We tried to find someone who'd seen anything in any way that could be helpful to us.
Police track down Sam Shoen in Phoenix. The devastated husband has no idea why anyone would target his wife.
You always do a background on the victim. So, I mean, she was a very outgoing person, attractive.
Eva was from Norway. She was very European in her outlook. She and Sam had a lot in common. They were outdoors people, and she didn't have an enemy in the world. No one had a reason to kill Eva Shoen.
A few hours later, Sam arrives home.
Our house was a crime scene. The police were there, and my kids were terrified.
And immediately, suspicion turns to him.
When you have a husband that is left and gone out of town, and his wife is murdered at the time he's gone, you're going to look at that person first.
But Sam's alibi checks out. And speaking with him further, the investigators discover something important about his family.
We wanted to know if we had any enemies, if there was anybody who would do such a thing, if I was involved in any disputes. And I said, yeah, we were involved in this litigation with U-Haul, and that it was very intense.
Sam tells the detectives his family owns U-Haul International and that they're involved in a heated feud.
That's when I discovered who the Shoen family was and what they owned. I knew right then this is going to be a can of worms.
As I understood it, the family had split into factions. There was the faction that was aligned with L.S. Shoen, with the father, which included Sam Shoen, and then the other faction of a couple of his brothers. And they were fighting over the control of the company. Obviously, a billion-dollar company, there was a lot at stake, a lot of money at stake.
It seems extremely unlikely to police that the killing could be a random crime.
Those kinds of things didn't happen in Telluride. We didn't have those kinds of random acts of violence. I thought there had to be some relationship between Eva Shoen and the person that either arranged for a murder or actually murdered her.
They told me that they thought it very well could have been a murder for hire, which opened up a whole new set of fears for myself and the kids. You start to think, well, what was the objective? Who was the intended victim? Were they coming back?
A hitman may have been contracted to kill a Telluride woman because of a family dispute. That's what the police are saying now. Eva Berg Shoen was found dead on Monday at the family home. Shoen's husband is involved in a family fight over the parent company of the truck rental company, U-Haul.
A few days later, Eva's autopsy shows no sign of a struggle or sexual assault, but reveals something else that only adds to the mystery.
What was discovered were 2 injection sites on the side of each breast. Sites where someone had stuck a needle into her twice, attempting to inject something.
The needle marks are described to me as being bilateral, very shallow. The pathologist took tissue samples trying to see any sort of drug somebody might have tried to inject her with. No results there.
Detectives are baffled, but just as they're beginning the search for leads, L.S. Shoen, the victim's father-in-law and billionaire founder of U-Haul, comes forward with a shocking allegation.
L.S. Shoen was personally persuaded that someone in the family in U-Haul management, directly or indirectly, had something to do with this murder.
He was very upfront. He said that the people responsible for it were his 2 sons who now had control of the company.
Not without a slug of reasons and evidence, as far as that goes, that either of my sons, Joe or Mark, are responsible for it, either directly or indirectly.
Sheriff Masters and Detective Pound head for Phoenix to look into a possible connection with U-Haul. When they arrive at company headquarters, twin 11-story buildings known as the Towers, they're taken to the top-floor office of Joe Shoen, the company's CEO. Also present is Mark Shoen, Joe's younger brother and right-hand man. But before the interview has even begun, Joe flies into a rage, shouting that Masters and Pound are only interested in one side of the story.
We had an appointment to speak with him, and it didn't go very well.
I knew when we started the interview that it was going nowhere. Mark had made a comment that I asked him, why would you think that somebody would kill Eva? And he said, I don't know. Happens.
Joe forbids the investigators from interviewing any U-Haul employees and has security escort them from the building.
Hardly the response that one would expect. You know, you can act defensively like that because you've engaged in guilty behavior, but you can also behave defensively like that when you think others are going to falsely accuse you. You know, either explanation fits it, but the response was just bizarre.
The Shoens weren't exactly Norman Rockwell material. But a contract hit on an innocent woman? It seemed unthinkable until investigators discovered just how bitter the U-Haul war had become.
In the weeks following Eva Shoen's murder, police in Telluride, Colorado have to wonder if the killing has anything to do with the U-Haul family feud.
Prior to Eva's death, there was this big feud in this family over control of this billion-dollar company. So there was some history there, and it seemed to be getting more heated all the time.
LS, concerned that the tiny sheriff's department is overwhelmed, offers the county $50,000 to fund the spiraling costs of the investigation.
He offered money to the Board of County Commissioners to help pay for the investigation, and I recommended to the commissioner, don't take any money. It's going to seem like we're the hired guns of L.S. Shoen, but they did take the money.
On the other side of the family, LS's estranged sons at the helm of U-Haul, Joe and Mark, have launched an investigation of their own.
Literally within a day or two of the murder, 2 private investigators hired by U-Haul showed up in Telluride, and they very, very much wanted to get involved in the investigation.
Why U-Haul would even feel the need to hire private investigators is beyond me. And the very first thing the private investigators did was hire a psychic.
The U-Haul private eyes seem, first and foremost, to be gathering information on someone they think is the prime suspect, Sam Shoen.
They were continuing to feed information to the sheriff to try and implicate me. At one point, they told the sheriff that the night of the murder I had been stopped between Phoenix and Colorado at a very high rate of speed by the police on the Indian reservation. Of course, that wasn't true.
Weeks after the murder, police still have little to go on. With accusations from the Shoens flying in every direction, the bad blood seems to be getting even worse, especially as LS continues to publicly accuse his sons of being involved.
LS says he still believes that Mark or Joe Shoen are somehow connected to the killing.
It could have been simply that they created an environment where people around them believed that if my son Sam was out of the way, that everything would be fine.
I guess LS wasn't expecting an invitation to Christmas dinner that year. Just who were the Shoen family, and what was the feud that had brought them to this point? Investigators were going to need to dig way back into the family history to figure it out.
L.S. Shoen is one of America's great entrepreneurs of the 20th century. He rates right up there with Henry Ford.
Like many American success stories, the Shoen family's fortune grew out of the burst of prosperity that followed the end of World War II.
L.S. Shoen got the idea for U-Haul when, immediately after the war, he had to move his family.
When he was discharged from the Navy, he was in Southern California. He had one child, me, and he had a few possessions, and he wanted to move back to Oregon.
He couldn't afford a van line, which was the option then. And what people typically would do, you would sell your stuff and strap some things on your roof of your car or something, and you would go and you'd buy new stuff. He didn't want to do that, so we came up with the concept of the rental trailers, and particularly the one-way rental.
With just $5,000 and his own welding torch, LS started building trailers.
Then he would go around to service stations and try and get service station operators to park the trailers on their lots.
The idea took off overnight.
One of the senior U-Haul employees told me that they always thought that the making of modern America had been the interstate highway system, Howard Johnson's, McDonald's, and U-Haul. That those were the 4 elements that were necessary to put America on wheels.
Meanwhile, LS's family was growing as fast as his company. He and his wife, Anna Mary, had 6 children in 11 years. But the family bliss would be short-lived. In 1957, Anna Mary died of heart failure.
Well, I have a very good idea how it affected my father because I know how my wife's death affected me. His situation was a great deal more difficult. He had 6 children, the youngest of whom was an infant, and I was the oldest at 12. And he had all the issues of trying to take care of appropriately that kind of a situation, plus run a business which by that time was quite large and very demanding.
I think that he probably just never really fully recovered from that. Had she lived, I think things would have been a lot different.
He handled it in an organized fashion like he handled everything else. He just thought that he'd get organized and take care of the kids.
About 2 years after my mother died, he remarried a woman by the name of Suzanne Gilbaugh.
By the mid-60s, LS and Suzanne had 5 more children. By now, his company employed thousands of people nationwide and owned a fleet of nearly 50,000 rental trucks and trailers. But for LS, family always came first.
And one of the reasons he built U-Haul was for his children. He began to gift to each of his children a percentage of the controlling stock of the company, and he saw no problem because he wanted his children to own the company. And as long as they were minors, he could vote the stock for them at the annual shareholders meeting.
Thanks to their dad's benevolence, even the kids in diapers became millionaire partners in the family business. It was a decision that would come back to haunt him. But for now, LS had his brood living like royalty.
After he remarried, the family lived a very affluent lifestyle.
On a whim in 1964, LS decided to relocate his family.
He was visiting Phoenix, really loved it, and just decided to look at houses, see what was there.
He learned about a Frank Lloyd Wright house that was available for sale. He went to see it, bought it on the spot.
It was a real showpiece. It got a lot of people who wanted to be around you because you had this appearance of money and power.
But the money and power of the Shoens was creating problems at home. Joe and Mark, the 3rd and 4th children, had become unmanageable, acting out frequently and quarreling with their parents, especially their stepmother.
They were very hostile and antagonistic and reportedly unruly. Joe is described as being hot-headed, confrontational, as behaving in a malicious way.
At one point, Joe's behavior toward his stepmother almost became violent.
There was a point in time where he became very enraged with her. And there was a story told that he took a gun to the house and waited in the darkness, allegedly for the purpose of killing her, but he didn't kill her. He didn't confront her.
LS began to try to solve family problems with money.
Because he blamed himself, because he'd been gone so much, he became an indulgent father who showered his children with all the wealth that he now had. By the time they were teenagers, they had a company credit card, they had a company car, they were on the company payroll, even though they didn't work.
As the children grew up, LS assumed they would work for the family business. But the 2 eldest, Sam and Mike, had different ideas. Sam entered medical school and began his residency. Mike went to law school and opened a small practice.
They never saw themselves as taking over the company. They wanted to have different careers. Joe was the 3rd son, and from the very beginning, he saw himself as the heir apparent to his father and saw himself as the man who would take over.
After finishing his MBA at Harvard, Joe came to work full-time at U-Haul. But LS wasn't satisfied.
LS Shoen ultimately formed the opinion that Joe simply lacked the temperament to take over the company. It wasn't that he didn't think he was smart. He just didn't think he had the kind of personality and the kind of discipline that was necessary. And Joe knew that, and I think that hurt a lot.
As the company faltered during the 1970s oil crisis, LS turned to his eldest sons for help.
LS decided that he wanted Sam to put the medical profession on the back burner and come in and run U-Haul as the oldest son.
And when my father basically begged my brother Mike and I to come help him, that really rained on Joe's parade. Because now he was not the only game in town. And he was very upset about that.
Joe must have been furious. Here he is, a Harvard MBA, being passed over for a guy with no business background. The battle was just getting started. But the question for investigators was, who would get caught in the crossfire?
As detectives investigating the murder of Eva Shoen are discovering, the intense rivalry between her husband Sam and his younger brother Joe dated back to the 1970s. Although their father was still firmly in charge of U-Haul, Sam and Joe Shoen were engaged in a fierce battle to be second in command.
I was having interactions with my brother Joe that I didn't understand. We were very different. He seemed to always have an agenda. We'd walk home at night together, and he'd tell me how the company was going bankrupt and how things were in terrible condition. And keep in mind, I'd trained as a physician, not as a businessman. So my response to that was to ask him to explain it, which he couldn't. He just says, we're going bankrupt.
But when Sam conferred with the company's CFO, he discovered his brother's claims were not true.
And in retrospect, clearly he was trying to scare everybody about my father's ability to manage the company.
Joe's resentment against his father was poisoning the atmosphere at U-Haul.
I think the struggle for control, it started dividing the family. And it went from being a very unique, dynamic place to work to being kind of a miserable place to work under those circumstances.
Combative and unpredictable, the Shoen brothers had the U-Haul staff scurrying around in constant fear. No one knew when the proverbial bullets were going to fly.
Joe would come in, and if he was angry at someone, he would order that they be fired. And employees would do it unless someone higher up told them not to.
There's disagreements between the boys because they're like in two factions now. So you have one boy leading the company this way, and this boy over here is going, we're not doing that. No. I think there might have been at least one fist fight in the building.
Detectives looking into this period at U-Haul hear rumors which fuel their belief that extreme violence might not be out of the question.
We were getting all kinds of reports. People were saying that there was guns and drugs, and we couldn't really verify any of that stuff.
Many people who dealt with U-Haul intimately believed that a culture of violence existed as it related to Joe and Mark, and that they were prepared to use extracurricular methods of intimidation or even physical violence to accomplish their goals.
Disgusted by his brother's behavior, Sam's focus changed. In 1975, he met a beautiful, recently divorced Norwegian woman named Eva Berg. Within a few years, they married and had 2 children, Bente and Espen.
She and Sam had a lot in common. They led a very active life, and she never involved herself in the U-Haul problems. And she just tried to be aloof from it all, just concerned herself with raising their children.
She's a very private person, shy, loved the outdoors, loved her dogs, and loved sort of simple things.
Sam was more outgoing. Eva was quieter and very kind and gentle. I would describe them as a very close, happy family.
Life may have been blissful at home, but Sam's work life was getting more and more contentious.
As the board meeting of 1986 approached, the resentments that a lot of the children felt towards their father had been building.
Even though LS owned only 2% of his company's privately held stock, he'd always voted his children's controlling shares however he pleased. But little did LS know, Joe had quietly been lobbying his brothers and sisters to wrest control from him.
He presented to his siblings that Daddy's old, the company's killing him, we need to unburden him.
The first indication I had of all this was that my brother Joe and Mark showed up in my office prior to an annual shareholder meeting, and they said that they had enough votes to elect their own board of directors, and they had a list of demands.
At the board meeting on November 8, 1986, Joe's plan worked. L.S. Shoen, the founder of U-Haul, was forcibly removed as chairman by his own son.
Joe insisted my father leave the company, and then the family agreed that I would be the chief executive officer, president, and Joe would be chairman of the board, and that we'd go forward like that. To make a long story short, that didn't work. Joe wanted to run the company, not be the chairman of the board. He definitely wanted me out.
There was a lot of intimidation going on. You had some pretty intimidating personalities involved. Joe and Mark were together, and that was very obvious.
It was obvious that this was a family situation that was destructive, and I didn't want to be involved. And so they left the company. Then I decided, well, I need to try and divest my ownership in the company.
But Joe, as chairman, refused to allow Sam to sell his shares. The only recourse Sam had was to fight back in court. Sam, allied with his father and some of his other siblings, mounted a massive series of lawsuits trying to extricate their wealth from U-Haul. But Joe and his supporters weren't backing down without a fight.
They spent over $30 million opposing us in litigation and had no qualms about doing anything.
But investigators had to wonder, could anything include murder?
These were people whose father gave them everything they ever had. When they got the opportunity, they did everything within their power to destroy their father, both professionally, financially, and every other way. And they did it in a completely ruthless fashion. So yeah, if they are capable of doing that to their own father, they certainly are capable of evil things.
In the months leading up to Eva's murder, things were so bad, employees began referring to the U-Haul towers as the Beirut Hilton. But just as investigators were finally pulling together the pieces of the Shoen family puzzle, the case would take a turn no one saw coming.
Weeks after Eva Shoen's murder, the investigation has been subsumed by a firestorm of accusations. Sam Shoen and his father, L.S., are pointing the finger at his brothers, Joe and Mark. Joe and Mark are deflecting suspicion back onto Sam, with their hired private eyes feeding information to the sheriff.
The story that they seemed to dwell on was the idea that somehow Sam had jumped in his high-speed car, had driven back to Telluride, murdered his wife, and made it back to Phoenix just in time to receive the phone call that his wife was dead.
But police find no evidence to corroborate that story, or any reason Sam would want Eva dead.
We couldn't find anything that indicated that he would have had any motive, any reason to do this.
At the same time, investigators are searching all over Phoenix for leads that might confirm U-Haul's involvement.
We did a lot of interviews within U-Haul. It was really difficult for us because you're dealing with a lot of attorneys, and it's hard to get real good interviews when everybody is guarded and is speaking through what I call their mouthpieces.
We could not find any sort of connection with U-Haul to Telluride or to this crime.
For the first year of the investigation, I was down to the sheriff's department almost every day. But it was just time after time after time, they were going down leads that ended up being false.
Determined to keep the investigation going, LS and Sam offer a $250,000 reward.
Well, that does tend to give us some good leads, but also sometimes the nuts kind of come out of the woodwork.
Well, this just opened the floodgates.
Some of the most bizarre leads anybody can possibly imagine. Everybody that ever had a bone to pick with U-Haul, they rented a U-Haul trailer and one of the tires was flat, they'd be calling us. Trying to sift through them in any reasonable way seemed to be impossible.
One caller claimed to see a Shoen brother passing money to a shady character in the back of a seedy bar. Another tale was that Mark Shoen was using U-Haul as a front for drug trafficking. Of course, all of these leads were false.
It was very difficult, extremely frustrating, and I had to rally myself and the troops every day to stay committed to solving this case, because it got pretty hopeless for a while.
Months pass, and the case is stone cold. Then, the television show Unsolved Mysteries runs an episode on the Shoen murder. The very next day, Sheriff Masters gets a hot tip from New Mexico.
A fellow by the name of Kelly Lemons called and reported that his brother-in-law had told him that he was responsible for this homicide.
So another investigator and I were assigned to go down to Farmington, New Mexico and interview Kelly Lemons. After dealing with all the kind of the nuts that we've been talking to, it seemed to be very believable.
The man Kelly Lemons implicates is Frank Marquis, a former used car salesman and convicted burglar and rapist who's been in and out of jail for years.
They found that he had committed 10 sexual assaults, had broken into people's homes several years earlier, and was convicted of those and served 10 years in prison.
We made arrangements with Kelly Lemons to do a recorded phone call with Frank Marquis.
Kelly.
Yeah.
Hey, Frank.
Hey.
What's happening?
Hey, that show was on again. They had it on Unsolved Mysteries again.
Well, don't worry about it.
Lemons asked him, well, you know, are you sure you covered everything up?
You sure they can't trace nothing back to you?
Absolutely.
No gun, no nothing, right?
Nothing. I don't want to talk about this.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
It was fairly obvious by listening to it that there was something there.
When I heard that, I knew that this was the hottest lead we had.
Detective Westcott discovers that at the time of the murder, Frank Marquis had been working at an auto body shop.
And we found the owner of the body shop. And he did remember that Frank Marquis and another employee of the body shop named Jeff Beal had gone to Telluride a few times.
The investigators tracked down Jeff Beal.
Beal told me that he had come to Telluride during the jazz festival of that year, and that Frank Marquis had brought with him a small caliber handgun that he had borrowed from a co-worker.
We were able to locate that employee, and we went and talked to him. We asked him, do you by any chance still have that gun? He says, yeah, it's over at the house. And, you know, so by now, you know, we're just about, you know, vibrating. We're so excited.
Ballistics on the shell casing found at the crime scene had indicated that the bullet came from a Lorcin .25 caliber handgun.
And sure enough, the firearm we recovered was a Lorcin .25 automatic.
But when police run a test, they make a surprising discovery.
They could not tell us for certain that the bullet that killed Eva Shoen came from that firearm. It was determined that someone had run a file or a drill through the barrel to alter the bullet characteristics.
The investigators believe Marquis probably altered the gun himself, specifically to throw them off his trail.
We had all that information. We had the fact that he was there. We had the gun. But the district attorney says that's not enough. We need more physical evidence.
Mr. Beal also tells us that during the drive back to Santa Fe, Frank wads up a bunch of his clothing and throws it out the window of his truck. I questioned Beal if he could find that location again. And once again, this is 4 years after they were thrown out the window. And so I brought him out here.
With Beal in the back seat, deputies drive the 400 miles of highway between Telluride and Santa Fe, hoping for an impossible bit of luck.
They combed up and down the side of the highway. They found several spots that Beal believed was where this happened. Fortuitously, it appeared at one place a grader of some kind had pushed a whole bunch of stuff up into a pile, and there was some cloth and some things sticking out of there.
Amazingly, the investigators recover 2 pieces of what appears to be badly decayed clothing.
The lab then analyzed all these pieces of clothing, very meticulously, one piece at a time, until they came up with a human hair.
DNA testing on the hair shows it to be a likely match for Eva Shoen.
I knew we had him. I knew that was the right guy, without a doubt. The chances of somebody else with his background coming to Telluride the same weekend, borrowing a Lorcin .25 auto, I know he was the one.
We went down to Santa Fe. By that time, we knew where he was living and arrested him.
LS and Sam suspected that Marquis was a link in a much bigger chain that would eventually lead back to Joe and Mark. But believe me, not everything was going to play out the way they expected.
Now the Telluride police finally have a suspect in custody. They're hopeful they can get him to reveal the whole story behind the Eva Shoen murder. Frank Marquis refuses to cooperate, but his strange behavior in jail only heightens investigators' suspicions.
We started hearing that Frank Marquis was hoarding in mustard packets, and he would, do this like mustard shampoo, sit there with tears running down his eyes. We had gotten a search warrant for his hair for DNA testing purposes, and it was jailhouse legend, apparently, that putting mustard on your hair would mess up the DNA. We were thinking, why would an innocent person do something like this?
I don't care how hard up you are for hair care. Innocent men don't slather their heads in condiments from the prison canteen. Frank Marquis might not have been talking, but he definitely knew more than he was letting on.
He had been charged, arrested, was in custody. We tried to get information from him that would allow us to find out if somebody else was involved, if he was part of a hired conspiracy.
Finally, after over a year in jail, Marquis agrees to talk. But his story is not what police are expecting.
I want you to really put yourself back in that time of 1990. He did make a confession, and he stated that he and Jeff Beal came up to Telluride to break into a drug dealer's home and steal all his drugs or money. He has Beal drive him to the ski ranches, and he decides that he's going to walk through the ski ranches and burglarize whatever homes he can.
Took me to the entrance, did a U-turn, I jumped out, and took off.
He told which places he had gone into to burglarize.
And I come up the back side of the house. I went into the bedroom because I figured that's where everybody hides their valuables. I found 2 cameras.
And then he walks up and he says he enters Eva Shoen's house.
I walk in, and there was maybe a little light in the kitchen. I go towards the bedroom to see if anybody's in there. As I'm listening, I'm not hearing anything. So I slowly open the door. Ms. Shoen is sitting up in bed, reading a book.
He says she jumps up and starts attacking him.
She was fighting me, and she was turning away, and I pushed her with this hand as she was turning back, and the gun went off.
She falls down on the bed and then gets up again and goes and collapses on the stair.
Attempting to corroborate Marquis' confession, police contact the homeowners Marquis said he robbed that night.
We were able to confirm that, yes, those places were reported burglarized, and there was actually one up in the ski ranches that he talked about going into and stealing some items that was unreported. And we later went and interviewed those people, and they said, you know, we wondered what happened to that stuff. And so we were very sure he was in there.
Marquis' story was consistent, in my opinion, with somebody who, in fact, was doing random break-ins. If you're up there to do a professional hit, you're probably not going to be wandering into somebody else's house.
Police grill Marquis for over 12 hours, but he never once implicates anyone else in the crime.
If Mr. Marquis had been in a position to say that this was part of any grander scheme and design, we would have given tremendous incentive to him to give us that part of the story. It never came forward.
I don't know a criminal around that'll spend 4 hours in jail, let alone 20 years in jail, if there's some way he can rat off someone else to get out of it. And you know, that didn't happen.
Police also believe that Marquis' statement is consistent with the crime scene and that the murder was not, after all, a professional hit.
It started coming together in my mind that the evidence does, in fact, fit a random crime. But it took me that long to figure it out. Looking at it from what I know now, it was a murder committed out of complete chaos, with no plan whatsoever.
Remember, everyone thought Eva's murder was the work of an expert hitman, the kind of guy you'd read about in a Robert Ludlum novel. Now it appeared the killer was this small-time hood who drove hundreds of miles to break into the Shoen's cabin. But to Sam and his father, L.S., the case was far from closed.
In November 1994, Frank Marquis pleads guilty to first-degree manslaughter and is sentenced to 24 years in prison. But despite Marquis' sworn confession, Sam Shoen and others still believe U-Haul must have been involved.
His story is completely implausible, that his intention was to burglarize the house. Well, there were 6 barking dogs, there were 3 children, there was a woman, and a car in the driveway. And there were lights on upstairs and downstairs. So that makes no sense whatsoever.
And when questioned about the bizarre needle marks on Eva's body, Marquis claims ignorance.
The needle marks were a mystery. I have no idea what those were. It's tough to find a logical explanation for for those needle marks.
Sam has a theory of his own.
I'm a physician, and obviously I had knowledge of drugs. I had access to drugs. I had access to syringes. And if I were being attempted to be implicated in a murder, that would be part of doing that.
And there's another unanswered question. What happened to the missing piece of Eva's bed sheet? Sam thinks it too was part of the plan to frame him for his wife's murder.
There was a piece of the bloody sheet on the bed that was cut out and removed. So again, if someone were trying to implicate me in a murder, that would have been a valuable piece of evidence to plant. I suspect that the whole thing was staged to implicate me, and that it didn't work the way they had intended.
When policemen and prosecutors have high-profile cases that they're under enormous pressure to clear, someone like Frank Marquis is manna from heaven. So we can ignore the needle marks. We can ignore the blood-stained portion of the sheet. We can forget all of that. Then the case goes away.
They believed there had to have been some connection to the other side of the family. And, we looked, and we just couldn't find any connection to that side of the family.
Frank Marquis is responsible for killing Eva Shoen. He didn't do it for any other reason than his own sick mind. And he confessed to it. There shouldn't be any lingering doubt.
But the years of bitter fighting, costly litigation, and vicious accusations have done their damage, dividing the Shoen family beyond repair. Around the same time the murder investigation wraps up, the family's decade-long legal battle over ownership of U-Haul comes to an end.
We won, and we got a judgment against them. We proved that what they had done was illegal. We proved that my brother Joe had done it with what the jury called the evil intent to injure us.
The court orders U-Haul to pay $1.5 billion in damages to LS and Sam's group, although the amount is later reduced to $462 million. The company and its directors, including Joe Shoen, declare bankruptcy.
We were all real tired, and so most of us just felt, my word, let's get away from all this trouble.
In October 1999, L.S. Shoen dies in a single-car accident in Las Vegas. His death is ruled a likely suicide. Today, Joe and Mark Shoen are still in charge of the U-Haul Corporation. Joe has served uninterrupted as CEO since his takeover of the company from his father in 1986.
The conclusion I reached was that in terms of the family, given its history, ultimately it almost didn't matter who did the murder, because the suspicions had been there for so long and were so deep-rooted that even if it was, as it turned out, an outsider, family's destroyed anyway.
Well, I guess, yes, it changed me. And I guess the lesson is that I have learned to accept that I'm a different person than I once was, and to go forward.
Sam Shoen has moved away from Telluride, remarried, and gotten on with his life. But even now, 17 years later, he continues to press Sheriff Masters to reopen the case. He still believes that somehow, some way, someone got away with murder. For True TV, I'm Dominick Dunne.